One. Hello, everyone, and welcome to V.A.C. Roundtable number 54. And we are very honored to have another of the following along the lines of people who we care about and respect. This is the Venerable Peter Grinspoon has decided to join us this fine Friday. And needless to say, it is an honor to have him. I was fortunate to know his father. I was also the PTSD study in his father's book, Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine. So I am thanked in the front, but of course, all those were submitted anonymously. And to know, needless to say, I followed Peter through the years via his father and was greatly inspired by his father. And Peter, of course, has risen to a doctor in his own right and has stood on his own 2 feet in his father's legacy, which is not an easy thing to do. And he has gone through Harvard. Again, same thing, just as not as easy to do. So with that in mind, let's see if we're having an issue with the Zoom connecting to the Facebook. Connection timed out. Let's try it again. There we go. All right. Now we're all the way through. Okay, so we're on Facebook Live. Ta-da! Nope, it basically did it again.
No, it's showing live.
Is it? All right. Let's see if we are, because it's giving me an error. That's not the case.
It dropped.
Yep.
This is the second time we've had trouble with this out of like 54, so I guess it's pretty good track record, but
yeah,
it's been recent that we've had trouble.
Let's try it one more time. All right. Description. Apologies for the slight inconvenience here, people. I'll be with y'all in. Oops. Yep.
Show us live again now.
Let's see if it's going through. Redirect. Okay, it went to my personal one, not to the V.A.C. one. One moment while I cancel this stop live stream. And try this one more time, this time with more feeling.
Third time's a charm.
All right. Rumor has it. Okay. Feel the love, feel the love. All right. Hardness for the technical difficulties that I know people are waiting for. And there we are. All right. So we're officially live now. Apologies. And so for my friends in the chat, here is the link directly for the Facebook if you want to share that around. So we're very thankful to have Peter Grinspoon. Of course, he is Dr. Grinspoon to many of the people of the world. And we're just going to start off getting right into the meat of things. Of course, you were born into the house of Lester Grinspoon to become a cannabis educator today. Can you give us some highlights of what got you to today, Peter? You're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
There we go. I figured that out. Sure, it was definitely an unusual household to grow up in. It was a wonderful household to grow up in. You know, it was confusing as you were growing up as like a preteen and a teen because, you know, in the house, we'd have all these cannabis advocates, cannabis users, cannabis like academics hanging around, smoking, talking, having these really inspiring, interesting conversations around the peace pipe, around the dinner table. And then we'd go to school and then be confronted with this anti-drug message. You know, cannabis makes you dumb, it makes you lazy, it makes you amotivational. And honestly, the people at home who were like using cannabis were so much more sort of engaged and interested and motivated and like actually trying to change the world and do something about the world's problems than the same policemen that kind of came in year after year with the DARE program to tell us that cannabis makes you dumb and amotivational. So I, at first, was very confused. Then as I got older, I realized they were like flat out lying to us about cannabis. And that's actually why the DARE program didn't work very well, because a lot of teenagers are smart and you don't lie to teenagers. It doesn't work at all. And then if you exaggerate about the cannabis, then you start talking about other drugs like alcohol, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. The whole message has gone out the window. I mean, once you've lost your credibility to the teenager, good luck getting it back. And so combine that with the fact that my brother Danny was suffering from childhood leukemia. And while he fought an unsuccessful battle against it, the cannabis really helped alleviate his symptoms and the symptoms of the chemotherapy. And, there are a few things that are as impactful as witnessing the alleviation of suffering in a family member. So I knew from a young age, I was like 8 years old, that cannabis was a medicine for certain people under certain circumstances. So when I went through medical school, which I eventually did, I studied philosophy in school. Then I spent 5 years working for Greenpeace as an activist. And then I went back to med school. I was sort of immune to much of the nonsense that they teach us in medical school. They really still don't, but back then did a worse job of educating physicians about cannabis. So I was pretty, not pro for everybody all the time for everything, but pro as this should be a tool in our toolbox. It should be legal. It should be accessible for people. And it should be one of the many things we could be allowed to use for pain, anxiety, insomnia, stuff like that, PTSD. So I was very interested in it from like day one of medical school.
Thank you for sharing that and sharing your perspective. I know that's just a quick synopsis of things, but that's where we're going to start today. Next up will be Councilmember Michael Krause with our next question.
Thank you, Etienne. It's so great to see you, Dr. Grinspoon, Peter. This question is about cannabis and using cannabis as an exit drug. And I think just before I ask the question, just for context, we definitely have military veterans in our ranks that are using cannabis as an exit drug, that their recommendation actually says, that they're using it for that, to help them get off of addiction. Many to most of the military veterans are reducing the amount of pills that they need to take. And that's another aspect of it. But right now we're actually seeing a new improved drug warrior message from the Kevins of vets of this world, saying the exact opposite, doubling down on the reefer madness myths. And even though the National Academies of Science, I think, put a nail in it in 1999, they said there was nothing pharmacological about cannabis that would lead you to another drug. But anyway, the question is, you speak openly about your addiction to opioids and about your cannabis use to get off of opioids. Can you give us a little bit from your perspective on that?
Definitely. That's a great question. First of all, Peter works just as well as Dr. Grinspoon, for anybody who's wondering. Dr. Grinspoon makes me feel old. I have a piece coming out on Tuesday in a medical journal called In Defense of Cali Sober, which, Cali Sober is when you're allowed to use cannabis or psychedelics as part of your recovery protocol. And I've long argued that we need a broader recovery tent, like the people in Alcoholics Anonymous. That works for some people, but that's just one way to go about recovery, and that people have to be open to using Suboxone, methadone, if psychedelics help them, or to use cannabis. I mean, cannabis does a lot of the same things that a lot of the recovery programs do. It helps you focus on gratitude, to connect with other people, to remain mindfully in the present moment, to like tolerate your distress. And cannabis can also help alleviate many of the things that are fueling the addiction in the first place, which is untreated chronic pain, treated insomnia, untreated anxiety, untreated depression. So cannabis really, really helps people. Now, cannabis can be addictive for some people. I think they greatly exaggerate how addictive it is, because they include in the definition of cannabis addiction tolerance and withdrawal, and that ropes in all the medical marijuana patients. Now, we don't use tolerance or withdrawal to define whether someone's addicted to medicinal opiates, because everybody who takes opiates has tolerance and withdrawal. So why would we use them for cannabis, if not just to pathologize all these people who are using it? So I do think the rates of cannabis addiction are exaggerated, but certainly some people get knocked off track with cannabis and can definitely get into trouble with it, because it's rewarding and it can cause euphoria, and different drugs affect different people in different ways. At the same time, that whole notion that you brought up of like the gateway theory to addiction, that turned out to be, and you nailed it, in 1999, even the Institute of Medicine report said that the gateway theory was complete nonsense. I mean, everybody that goes on to become addicted to heroin drinks milk as a child, right? They are associated. But that doesn't mean that drinking the milk, the little baby drinking the milk, that isn't causing the heroin addiction. The same is true for tobacco and alcohol, and then for cannabis, just because it's a common drug. There's no causal relationship to the cannabis use and the other drugs. So I think that that's really been exaggerated a lot. And I don't think cannabis is in any way incompatible with someone's recovery, as long as that's not what they were addicted to in the first place. And you have to try. Addictions can be a little bit unpredictable, and not everything works for everyone. I mean, some people take Suboxone and get really dependent on that. And even though Suboxone is a great treatment for addiction, it's not for everybody. Same with methadone. Some people find methadone really rewarding. So again, I think cannabis should be a tool and an option that we are allowed to use. And I think we're making a huge mistake if we go along with the addiction psychiatrists and they just don't understand cannabis very well. They think it's like alcohol, like you're intoxicated or you're not intoxicated. They don't realize that cannabis has a whole nuanced spectrum of effects, some of which are really helpful, some of which might not be so helpful, but it's not all or nothing anything. It's not all good. It's not all bad. It's not all helpful, and it's not all unhelpful. And again, I think cannabis has a really important role in the opiate crisis. It can help treat people with chronic pain. It can help people sleep better. It can help them with their anxiety, with their insomnia. And cannabis is really, really good for people on opiates for their withdrawal symptoms. As someone who's withdrawn dozens of times from opiates, unfortunately, though not for the last 15 years, because I've been in a very solid recovery, I can tell you that cannabis is more effective than anything else for the opiate withdrawal. The only thing I don't use cannabis for is I prescribe Suboxone, right? Buprenorphine. There's such good data with buprenorphine that with someone who's addicted to opiates, if there's a 50 to 80% reduction in overdoses and deaths. We don't have that data yet with cannabis. We might one day, hopefully we'll be studying it. We'll have that kind of data. So right now, I don't use cannabis directly to get people off opiates. I do for chronic pain, but not if they're addicted to opiates. If they're addicted to opiates, I use methadone or Suboxone, just because we have really good data. And I use cannabis as an adjunct for the withdrawal symptoms, for the anxiety, for the insomnia. So I know some cannabis proponents say it's really the same thing as methadone and Suboxone. I don't think we're quite there yet. But in every other aspect of this, I'm completely on board. I think cannabis is a very helpful a treatment for addiction. And I think Cali Sober is going to be a very, where people are using cannabis to help as a harm reduction technique. As I say, in a perfect world, we'd all do yoga, eat tofu or broccoli and meditate all the time. But in reality, most people need something at the end of a hard day's work. Their muscles are hurting, their nerves are frayed. And if people are given a legal choice between alcohol and cannabis, many are going to pick cannabis, and it's going to be a huge advantage in terms of harm reduction.
And that's a key discussion point that isn't really talked about as much nowadays is harm reduction, and that is a key component. But I would love for, California sober to become, cannabis sober.
Oh, it is kind of a funny name, isn't it?
So. Yeah, I mean, it's a reference to California, and, that has both positive and negative connotations, depending on, I grew up in the deep south of Louisiana, and we were told to stay away from California, that was an evil, bad place. I've resided there for the past 30 plus years, and I own the oldest cannabis dispensary in the States. So, I didn't listen so well, but at the same time, it also, structure of nomenclature has its basis in people's understanding or willingness to understand too. So that's where the California thing makes me wonder, does it have avocado and sprouts on it? Or
well, it makes me wonder what's Massachusetts sober.
Right, exactly. Because cannabis, is legal not just in California anymore. So touche. With that, we're going to go on to our next question, which will be by Council Member Nate Landau. Council Member.
Thank you so much for being here with us. And my question is, what is your goal with the publication of Seeing Through the Smoke? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. Seeing Through the Smoke, I mean, on one level, it was meant to be like the third part of a trilogy. You know, my dad wrote Marijuana Reconsidered in 1971, and then he wrote Marijuana the Forbidden Medicine in 1993, which was perfect right before legalization in California in 1996 of medical. But it needs to be updated. I mean, it's been like 29 years. And furthermore, I think there's more freedom among physicians now to say what they really think about cannabis. We'll see if I still have a medical license in a couple of weeks, by the way. But at this moment, I think there's more freedom. So for example, the last chapter in the book, before I talk about some personal stuff with my brother and my dad, the last chapter in the book talks about recreational uses and not just the harms. I do talk about the harms. How bad is it for teens? How bad is it if you're pregnant? How bad is it before driving? I talk about the benefits. I use the latest science. You know, what is the evidence for helping people with autism, for getting people off other addictions and so forth, for insomnia, for chronic pain. But I have a whole chapter on like how people use it, including myself. I talk about my own use, how people use it to appreciate their understanding and their enjoyment of like sex, creativity, spirituality, art, connecting with other people. You know, we have an epidemic of loneliness. I see this every single day as a primary care doctor. I work as my day job as a primary care doctor in an inner city clinic. And we just have this epidemic of loneliness. And like, you know, some of these older patients were just making appointments to see me in the pandemic just to have someone to talk to. It was so sad. And, you know, even though they only give us like 20 minutes to talk to people, I talk to them for like an hour, but then after that, I feel really guilty. I'd be getting behind and everybody be mad at me. So I'd have to be like, look, I'm really sorry. I have to end the visit. And like cannabis can help people with all this stuff. So I really felt like there was a lot of stuff my dad wasn't allowed to say just due to the constraints of his time. Now, my dad had no, you know, problem saying what he wasn't supposed to say, but I think that, you know, it sort of evolves. And now, but also what I wanted to address is that it's completely dysfunctional that in our society, we have two different views of cannabis. I mean, depending on which activist, which veteran, which doctor, which scientist, which social worker you talk to, it sounds like you're talking about two different plants grown on different planets. And that's completely dysfunctional. It can't both be like the satanic weed and a cure-all for everything. I mean, there has to be some truth in the middle. So I was really trying to argue, seeing through the smoke, the perspective from both sides. I mean, I argue it from the people that are against cannabis, and I argue it from the people who are in favor of cannabis. And I really try to come up with as much common ground as possible. I mean, surely we can agree about pain and insomnia, right? Surely we could agree that we don't know if it's safe in people who have like psychosis, like it can destabilize them. I mean, certainly there's some areas we can agree on, and I'm just hoping that we could expand the areas that we can agree on, because it'll be so much more functional if we could all come to some meaningful agreement and have this be one less issue that we're all fighting about. I mean, you know, the pro people are very pro and the anti people are really anti, but most people are sort of in between, and it's really confusing to them because one day they hear in the news helps with chronic pain, the next day they hear in the news causes schizophrenia, which it doesn't, by the way, but causes schizophrenia. And it's very confusing to people that don't know much about it. So I was just hoping to provide one book that goes over both sides. Obviously, I announced at the very beginning that I'm more pro than anti. It helped my dad, it helped my brother, it helped me, it helps a lot of my friends. So I admit where I'm coming from, but then I make the point that everybody has a bias in this issue. It's a really emotional issue for people, and that let's try to put aside our biases, and the people who are in favor of it should want to know the harms. Just like I'm not a big drinker, but I want to know what the harms are of alcohol, so then I could drink or not drink depending on, you make an informed decision. And people who are against it should want to know the benefits, because that's why everybody's using it and no one's telling their psychiatrist, because people are getting benefits. So I just think both sides would learn a lot from knowing where the other side's coming from, and that there is a lot of overlap we could have, and it's not all black or white thinking. The truth is very nuanced and in between. So I hope to flesh that out with all the different flashpoint issues around cannabis.
Yeah, thank you for that. One of the things that we were proponents and have been the last two times we're up on Capitol Hill is we have a problem. Our veterans are, isolated in certain states, so there's a treatment by geography that is happening that shouldn't be taking place, that you touched on, but is a reality for many patients. And one reason why we're going to concentrate on states that do not have access for our veterans, because unfortunately it's still a patchwork of 10th Amendment out there, and we don't have a solid foothold for everyone yet. So that's one of the reasons we're working with other veterans so that we can, affect change and stop this treatment by geography so that we can have universal coverage for our veterans, which would be a nice start for us.
And they do that in Canada, right? I mean,
Yes, absolutely. The
if you do
treatment
it, why can't we do it? I mean,
the treatment in Canada is the gold standard as far as we're concerned, because they have an actual disability rating, and if you're 100% disability rating, you get 3 grams per day of you choose your modality, and then you can order it on the app of your phone. And within 48 hours, the Canadian Postal Service mails it to you. So we're trying to actually put the American VHA and Canadian VHA together so that we could figure out how to get those people, talking, because that's a standard we would love to get, because we have that standard for our regular medications. If I want my Percocets or, my psych meds or anything else via the VA, they come via the mail. Whereas, it could be the same for cannabis, but we're still a far way away from that. But we think that discussion is very valid, because it would also take away the problem of that treatment by geography because of the isolation. Here in California, we even have dry counties, cities, and areas. So it is very important to have access that is, not necessarily direct, local. So that is a key component that is still missing, and one we're working toward. Nor here nor there. Let's get to our next question, which will be Council Member Wade Laughter.
Yes. First of all, Peter, it's hard for me to say that because I know how hard you worked to get that doctor in front of your name. I also think it's spectacular that you're a second generation cannabis person, an activist. I know second and third generation growers, but I think you're the first second generation activist I know, and doctor. Long-winded way of getting to my question. I think one of the challenges for veterans as well as patients across this country is that doctors aren't really informed about the endocannabinoid system. Could you offer some guidance to all of us about how can we get medical schools to add to the already overcrowded curriculum something about the ECS, since it seems to play such an essential part in people's well-being? Thank you.
well, that's a great question. Well, thank you for your kind words. And let me just say that I had the best mentor and role model there was. So I can't take all the credit for being who I am. But I wrote a piece for Harvard Health on the endocannabinoid system just about 6 months ago, which is good for doctors. People bring that into their doctors, or they can bring my book in to doctors that talks about the endocannabinoid system. But it's more complicated than just the endocannabinoid system. I mean, the endocannabinoid system is critical. It's the whole system of neurotransmitters and receptors that we all have in our brains. The endocannabinoid system is like 500 million years old. It like far predates human beings and cannabis use. Like all animals have an endocannabinoid system. We've been using cannabis for 5,000 to 10,000 years. The endocannabinoid system just sort of cannabis just sort of bootstraps onto our endocannabinoid system and like mimics it and gives us all these really good effects from it medicinally. So, but it far predates human beings, the endocannabinoid system. And it's nuts that we're not teaching it to doctors, like absolutely crazy. It is taught, according to a recent poll, in 13% of medical schools. Now, regardless of what you think of cannabis, if you're like pro, neutral, anti, if you think it's like the devil's lettuce and should be banned, like you should understand the endocannabinoid system so you understand the harms. You can't understand the harms or the benefits of cannabis if you have no idea how it works. Furthermore, the endocannabinoid system regulates so many other systems in our body. It regulates feeding, temperature, reproduction, fear, memory processing, appetite. That's why if you understand the endocannabinoid system, you understand how cannabis can do so many things at once for a patient. And if you don't understand the endocannabinoid system, it sounds just kind of like magical thinking. Like a patient with fibromyalgia, if you give them cannabis, it could help with numb their pain. It could help with their perception of the pain. Like, this isn't really bothering me that much, so I can do other things and engage in my life. It could help with their anticipatory fear of having pain. It could help with their anxiety, their insomnia. And the rating that always goes up is quality of life. The health-related quality of life always improves with medical cannabis versus these other pharmaceuticals that we use, none of which I'm against. I use all of these in my primary care practice. It's just a question of using the least toxic one for the right patient and having as many tools available in your toolbox to make the patients as comfortable as possible. And so it just doesn't make any sense for not to teach the endocannabinoid system. I think younger doctors are pretty outraged that they're not teaching it. Medical students are outraged. And there's a lot of pressure on the medical schools to start teaching the endocannabinoid system. So I think that's happening and that's getting there. I mean, in addition to the fact that they're teaching it in Israel, in Europe, in Canada, like in South America, all over the world, except in the US, like there's only so much drug war boneheadedness that we can get away with and not start to lose our medical credibility. So I think it's definitely getting there, but there's also just a lack of practical know-how about cannabis. First of all, there are different groups of doctors saying different things about cannabis. The psychiatrist just came out with a paper recently saying that it shouldn't be used at all to treat anxiety, depression, or PTSD because there's no data. And that's sort of like flies in the face of the millions of people that actually are using it for anxiety, depression, and for PTSD that they don't even see because they don't treat people for these things. They don't treat people with cannabis. I mean, what a doctor thinks of cannabis is a little bit dependent on their vantage point. So, for example, like the oncologists are all in favor of it because they see their patients getting better on chemotherapy. Whereas like the pediatric psychiatrists who see the rare but very tragic train wrecks of when like a kid gets destabilized by cannabis or their psychosis gets worsened, they tend to get this over exaggerated notion of how harmful it is. And the truth is it has harms and benefits, but doctors need, no matter what they think, to be able to create a climate where patients can speak comfortably with them, not just about cannabis, but about all the drugs. I mean, if more people could speak about opiates with their doctors without fear of judgment and shame, less people would be overdosing on fentanyl. So I think the doctors have a real obligation to create a climate, regardless of what their personal feelings are, to make it so that patients feel very comfortable talking about cannabis and about other drug use. And then finally, the irony is that as a medical cannabis doctor, I'm a primary care doctor, a general doctor for adults. It makes my life so much easier to have cannabis because I can treat insomnia, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, some of the most actually difficult things to treat as a primary care doctor. And the alternatives are awful. The non-steroidals, that give you heart attacks and ulcers and destroy your kidneys, or the opiates we don't even have to talk about. There aren't good options, for example, for chronic pain or for sleep. So if you can offer people a relatively non-toxic, plant-based, natural medication that can help them alleviate their suffering with less of the side effects than many of the pharmaceuticals, doctors are going to start adopting this once they realize how much easier it makes their lives and how much better it makes the lives of their patients.
Absolutely. We actually asked the world body about the endocannabinoid system at the 66 C&D a few months ago. And to our surprise, they know what it is and they're aware of it. So we know that Kevin Sabet has been up there spreading his shenanigans. So it was nice to see that the education is also at the highest levels of government. So, but it still hasn't filtered down to all the doctors yet. So thank you
You
for
wonder
that.
if he really believes what he says is the funny part, but that's a whole nother conversation.
That's a whole other thing, but we won't get into that.
I just put my blog in the endocannabinoid system in the chat if anybody's interested.
Thank you. Very appreciate that. Our next question will be Council Member Alex Popoff. Council Member.
Hello. Thank you, Peter. It is also hard for me to call you solely by your first name, but I'll honor the request. Thanks again for joining us. And you kind of touched on this question already regarding harm reduction and how you view cannabis as an alternative harm reduction herbal/drug. And what I was going to say is I've personally at the VA been told that I need to reduce cannabis to 0.3 grams or I won't be able to get certain testing and things, not benefits, but and then at the same time, I received messages from fellow veterans asking on behalf of other veterans, hey, what's going to happen? My doctor said they're going to cut off my opioids if I test positive for THC. And we have council members like Member Crowitz that worked hard on changing these policies, and several members in this group that know that that is not supposed to happen. And these doctors don't even understand that it could take up to 3 months for a urinalysis to test clear of THC under certain circumstances. So they expect this guy to stop his cannabis that they believe is so dangerous and has a high potential for addiction and withdrawal, just cut it off cold turkey, and then, or they're going to take his opioids cold turkey. And that just isn't medical practice, but I'm not a doctor. So the question is, as it relates to harm reduction, how is this still happening in modern day? And you, like I said, you described that you give cannabis for this exact reason, so people coming off opioids can either use less opioids or perhaps not need them for chronic pain patients. So was there anything you wanted to elaborate on regarding the harm reduction component? Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, that was about 6 questions, but they were good questions. And
Sorry about that.
this is one of my favorite topics. But first of all, completely unethical to kick people off pain pills because they test positive for cannabis. A lot of clinics do that. I don't know why they do that. You wonder if they just feel like the cannabis is somehow competition to the injections they like to give. You know, there's that Upton Sinclair quote where it's difficult to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on him not understanding it. And I think that that's been part of the reason why some pain doctors and some guys, some pain doctors and some psychiatrists don't prescribe cannabis. I just wonder in my cynical moments if that's the case, because, you know, if you treat your own anxiety, you don't have to pay a psychiatrist $400 an hour to get a pharmaceutical. But the fact is, the doctors haven't been taught much about cannabis. So it's not entirely their fault. I mean, it is and it isn't. I wrote a very emotional chapter in this book, Seeing Through the Smoke. Doctors are supposed to do no harm. And this chapter is called Do Be No Harm, about doctors like being on the wrong side of the war on drugs and how this happened. And, you know, when cannabis was originally criminalized in the 1937s, one of the leading voices against criminalization was the American Medical Association, because it was a widely used medicine back then. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were like 150 scientific papers written about cannabis, and people were using tinctures all the time. The doctors were completely on board with it. And then, due to withering pressure from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger, which was the predecessor to the Drug Enforcement Agency, and I guess Robert DuPont, the doctors really flipped sides, and it's really shameful that they did. And the way my dad described it is that doctors were both perpetrators of and victims of the vast misinformation about cannabis coming from the US government. But to me, you know, there were people like Andy Weil, like my dad, like, there are just a bunch of people, Norman Zinberg, who did Set and Setting. There are a bunch of people who were able to think for themselves on cannabis and get it right. So you wonder why more doctors weren't able to get it right over the last half a century. In my dad's book, Marijuana Reconsidered, which I'm sure some of you have read, he proved that in 1968, Playboy, which used to have really good journalism, had better reporting on cannabis, much more accurate reporting than the Journal of the American Medical Association. And honestly, the Journal of the American Medical Association, they love to feature really negative, scary stories about cannabis. And I feel like they don't, like, in a fair and unbiased manner, like, feature the good, the bad, and the ugly. They really have a tilt toward the negative. The same for many of the medical journals. And it's changing a little bit recently. But so I think part of the problem is that doctors are like not fed really balanced information about cannabis. So they aren't taught about the endocannabinoid system, going back to the last question. So they don't really understand how it works. And then most of what they're taught about cannabis is in an exaggeratedly negative manner. And then the third thing is just sort of like mystifying to them, because they don't have much practical information. Like if a patient, and then the VA doctors were further handicapped by all those stupid rules that they weren't allowed to talk to patients about cannabis until very recently. They're still not allowed to certify patients, but at least they're allowed to have a conversation about it. Like, that was just so unethical and stupid. So the VA doctors in particular have been really hamstrung, but doctors in general, I mean, I went to a continuing medical education conference at my own institution, and the part of medical cannabis was awful. They had this book that was just written by this prohibitionist, and they just told us nonsense after nonsense. I was shocked, like my jaw hit the floor. So I think we just have a huge job in terms of teaching doctors enough about cannabis so they could comfortably talk to patients. That doesn't mean they have to be huge zealots. They have to be advocates. That doesn't mean that they have to recommend it, but they have to be able to have a reasonable, adult, mature, and non-stigmatizing conversation with their patients. So I feel so bad when I hear these stories and that people are getting kicked out of pain clinics or denied their service benefits for cannabis use. And in reality, cannabis helps so many vets, and it would save the Veterans Administration so much money on these other pharmaceuticals like gabapentin that don't work as well and cost so much more, that if they had any brain whatsoever, they'd be embracing cannabis with both arms. However, we're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. So, I mean, hang tight. I mean, at some point, we're going to get federal legalization. I mean, what are they going to do? We have legal marijuana now in 38 states. Are they going to wait till we have 50 states and still have federal illegality? At some point, it starts to just get like preposterous. So I think we're definitely getting there, but it is really, really frustrating. And your question is very poignant because it's this needless suffering that they're causing people.
No, and thank you for taking the time to answer each one of those. And thank you for Councilmember Popoff for those additions.
I'll fix.
Next, we will go to Councilmember George Armstrong. Councilmember Armstrong.
Yes, first of all, thank you for being here tonight, Peter. Like Wade said, I find it hard to say that, but if that's what you prefer, I'm happy to use it. You're a primary care physician, and you talked about not being open to suggesting cannabis to these chronic pain PTS patients. Are there other modalities like mindfulness, meditation, yoga that you recommend as a council? And you also talked about harm reduction. As a council, we've talked about that, and we found that it might, it's not always the only thing. Do you offer other modalities?
Well, those are great questions. First of all, in addition to being a doctor, I'm a certified health and wellness coach. So I incorporate a lot of that stuff in my practice. The doctors were burning out so quickly that they trained a bunch of us in my hospital to become certified health coaches. And I jumped at the chance. And I help people a lot with, imposter syndrome and procrastination and burnout and like the moral injury of like trying to provide good care to people in a system that's slowly collapsing. And I give a talk too. It's interesting at the Mind Body Center on mindfulness and recovery from addiction. I think mindfulness is really a critical component to all of this. And that's something that ironically, the cannabis helps people with so much. Now, I incorporate a lot of the coaching techniques into my primary care practice. I think that no matter what you're fighting, if you're fighting insomnia, if you're fighting chronic pain, if you're fighting, chemotherapy, fighting cancer, if you're fighting trauma, I think that you could set yourself up for success with healthy habits. If you eat healthy, if you get enough sleep, if you stay hydrated, if you exercise, you're just calmer, more mindful, more present during the day. And then whatever else you're contending with is a lot easier. So then if you use cannabis or use something to sleep or use something for pain, that will work better because you set yourself up for success. So, I just don't get why people are in such different warring camps. Like there's Western medicine and there's Eastern medicine. Like, why can't they complement each other? Like for some things, the pharmaceuticals are really good. And for something, mindfulness, meditation, perhaps acupuncture are really good for. I think we should be open to all of these things. And that by using the wisdom of all these different ancient healing traditions, we can do a much better job than if we bunker ourselves in just one school of thought or another. So I've never understood why people are so hostile to other ways of looking at things. I mean, at the end of the day, if it helps the patient, that's great. And how is meditation or being mindful or being connected to the present or listening to people or practicing gratitude, how could that possibly hurt anything? How could that possibly do anything but make your situation better, regardless of what your situation is? So I'm a huge believer in like positive thinking and in healthy habits. I think that really helps. But, if someone needs Percocet or they need some morphine or, they need a heavy duty club for their slip disc, I'm happy to do that as well. So again, I just think we pick and choose and we do a much better job if we're open-minded to all the different modalities so that we have more tools in our toolbox.
Thank you for that as well. Needless to say, we'll go on to Councilmember Al Byrne. Councilmember.
Well, Dr. Grinspoon, thank you so much for accepting my invitation to speak to us tonight on behalf of for the V.A.C. I do personally appreciate it. Thank you. I'd like to, before I ask my question, I've got one thing I'd like to say to the audience, regardless of what you've heard here. If you're a veteran and you use cannabis, you will not be denied any benefits. You won't be, and you will be not denied treatment in any BHA facility. And if you are, then you need to call one of us, any one of us, and we'll get it taken care of. But you'll not believe, I just want, because the stories we hear, no benefit loss, nothing. And then Peter, on a personal level, you know, I worked with your dad many times, respected him greatly, all the way back to, gosh, I think I met your father first about 1990 when I was running Normal. And he was very instrumental in helping me and others get the medical cannabis issue off the ground floor, very instrumental. But, you know, I just want to point out to you, you probably got this, but when you talk about Norman Zinberg, your dad, Todd McArear, these guys were all psychiatrists. And they took, I watched this go down. They took a heavy beating from their peer group. You know, it's sort of an aside here, but I was sort of like, wow, that isn't good. But anyway, your father again, Lester, I admired him greatly. We had a good time together many times. I expect that his influence on you was terrific. I expect you sort of indicated that, yeah, you sat around the dining table with some really smart people. And I just want to say, it was so nice of you to bring your mother on. She looks terrific. I have always admired her because I know that your dad wrote the book, but it was your mother that instigated. We'll get to that, but your mother did that. So thank you for bringing her. So anyway, the question is, did your dad have anything to do with going into cannabis? I think it's obvious, but we got to ask that question. Thank you.
Did he have anything to do with my brother using cannabis, or
no, with you getting into cannabis?
Oh, with me getting into well, indirectly, absolutely. I mean, of course, you know, he made it like the forbidden fruit at home. So we started smoking at a very early age because we weren't allowed to, but that's true for all teenagers. And they certainly made it look really fun. Honestly, like the dreary anti-drug message we get at school, you know, contrasted with like just all the humor and joking and like animated conversation and kindness that I'd see along with the peace pipe. I mean, I came to associate the smell of cannabis with like healing because of my brother, and with like, you know, good humor and laughter, not with like these morbid, you know, whatever car crashes or syringes or whatever they showed us in middle school. So he certainly, you know, made me very interested in it, made it seem fun. And, you know, I think that among other things, he had a lot of intellectual integrity. And I really got to watch his journey. You know, he really started off writing Marijuana Reconsidered with the mind frame, like his contemporaries. You know, what are these crazy young people doing, smoking all this cannabis? They're probably hurting themselves. I'm going to research it and I'm going to write a book about it. And then when he thought for himself and did a deep dive, he realized that actually, you know, it does have its harms, like everything else does, but the harms of criminalization are much worse than the harms of like actually using cannabis. So why on earth would it be criminalized? And you're absolutely right that he got so much crap from his colleagues. I've been writing actually a series of newsletters about my dad. The first one was about Carl Sagan. The second one was about John Lennon. The third one was about this crazy trip he took to Kuala Lumpur for this guy, Kerry Wiley, who was sentenced to death for medical cannabis use. And my dad and Ramsey Clark got him off the hook. The fourth one, which is in process, which I'm writing as we speak, is about the crap that he got The subtitle is "What does Richard Nixon and Harvard Medical School have in common?" Because they were the two ones that really went after my dad. I might not really be able to call it that because I'm at Harvard and I don't want to get fired right away. I mean, I don't mind that much, but I'll try not to. But it's really incredible, like, some of the things he had sent that I have, like, "You dirty Jew, you're just doing this to weaken the white Christian nation," or, Richard Nixon called him a clown and said, "What's wrong with all the psychiatrists? They want to legalize marijuana. They're all Jewish." And then, the whole campaign, my dad, he published 180 scientific papers and wrote 11 books. And now his books are really, really good. He was a great writer, and he was never fully promoted to professor at Harvard. And even the Harvard Crimson, like the student magazine, came out with this really strong editorial in the year 2018 called Grinspoon Reconsidered, just like flat out accusing Harvard of like discriminating against my dad because of his position on cannabis and psychedelics. I mean, it was like completely unethical. And, now we have this beautiful Center for the Study of Psychedelic Medicine at Harvard. And, you just wonder when they're going to start airbrushing my dad back into the photos. It'd be really interesting to see. But, that wasn't really what he was about. He wasn't really about the acclaim. And he didn't really care that much that Harvard was. But it was really, I have some very disrespectful letters that I'm going to be publishing next month about how they told him not to talk about marijuana at Mass Mental Health Center, where he worked for 50 years, because that was personal business. And it's like, he just wrote a book about it. Like, why would he not be allowed to talk about it at his office? Like, I'd love for them to try to tell me not to talk about it. Like, they just don't do that anymore. And the first time he met this guy, Joseph Coyle, I have this letter too. He met him in front of all the psychiatrists, because this was the new combined director of psychiatry at Harvard. And the guy walked up to my dad at this faculty meeting. My dad had never met him before. Dr. Coyle said, "I've read your book on psychedelics and I don't like it one bit." And he walked away from my dad in front of like all the psychiatrists, like their first meeting. And like, this book was in 1979, calling from the rooftops for us to use psychedelics in psychiatry and for us to research them. And now everybody's on board with that. He was 40 years ahead of his time. And for him to be shot down that hard for saying something, independent, let alone something that turned out to be true 40 years later, is just such a black mark on the whole Harvard psychiatry department. And not to mention that Andy Weil, who wrote the foreword to my book, Seeing Through the Smoke, got into hot water too for publishing the first randomized controlled trial showing that cannabis was an effective medicine. So Harvard does not have a great track record. The way Harvard works is that they're sort of against. Though in my case, they've actually given me a lot of latitude. They haven't supported me, but they haven't bothered me at all. So I'm quite grateful with that. I'm very happy with that. But what they'll do is, if they're going to be against and conservative against, and then we'll cross over some invisible threshold of like public opinion, and then they're going to be like, "We're Harvard Medical School. We're the best in the world at medical cannabis. We've always been in favor of medical cannabis." And it's going to be just this shift in what they're saying. So I'm just waiting for that to happen as well. So I suspect my dad is going to start popping back up into the photographs any day now. But it is really troubling what a hard time they gave him, especially because he wasn't even talking about cannabis. He was talking about the criminalization of cannabis and how that's more harmful. So I don't know. History is going to write a really interesting chapter about all of this.
And I hope it does your father and others justice, because my other doctor was Dr. Todd McCurria. And needless to say, yeah, I was very blessed to have some great ones in my life that, inspired me to continue to be the activist that I am, because of the activism that was foisted upon them. When 215 happened, Dr. Todd and my other doctor, Frank Lucido, had to actually fight the government, who actually had the full weight of it come down on them, and had to fight for doctor-patient confidentiality. And this is in the 1990s, people. So, it's still rather fascinating to see the hate and the vitriol and the lack of acceptance, much less willingness to look past the veil for themselves. So it's still interesting, and I'm thankful for people like you to, one, continue on your legacy, but also putting out sound and logical information to dispel the misinformation that has been so prevalent. It is key to everyone's sanity. And with that, I will go to the venerable Michael Green for our next question.
I think venerable is probably an overstatement. I've got a buzz on. I hate to do this. And so many thoughts in my mind. This has been a fabulous, incredible presentation. I like your perspective, looking for balance, Doctor. And all right, I'll call you Peter. I wanted to also thank you for sending me those book plates. Your book went over very well at the V.A.C. People were receptive. Almost everything that's been touched on this evening, the conversation shows up at least in the first 65 pages of the book. As I get deeper into it, I'm really appreciating this. Sounds like well-balanced, well thought out. There's somebody that's honest with themselves about what their prejudices and biases are. Canatopians, reefer pessimists. I love the phraseology. A moment ago, I think if I got this right, you said something was immoral and ridiculous. I don't know. I think I'm misquoting what I thought I heard. I onto it, but basically translated in my mind, it's immoral. The prohibition is immoral. Rationality has to come out, and hopefully we are close to collectively accepting some kind of truth about the reality of what this natural plant medicine does for us. I'm going to have a question later, follow up on the cost of cannabis confusion, but to personalize this, so this thing reads partially autobiographical, and then it reads like nonfiction, and then there's, that it needs to be, but the exposition is really good. But to bring it back to home, and Al touched on this, and Al, thank you for the public service announcements for the veterans and our benefits, our availability is, question arises. So what transpired in your household? As I read it in the prologue, so it's right on the first page. You get into what is, you touch on the outside of what's happening in your household, that dynamic as your parents are having this discussion. Your mother, so apparently your parents had some long discussion, how much that you actually heard, I don't know, or heard later, but your brother has leukemia, he was ill. If I got this right, you're one of 3 brothers, or just the 2 of you? 3. Right?
There are 3.
And,
3 now.
Yeah. And just what that might have been like. And then she goes out and reaches out to your brother's friend, Mark, to try to score for Danny and brings it home. And then I wasn't clear if Danny already had a pipe with some weed in it, or if this was, hey, I got some stash. So just how that felt, what the human dynamic of that was in your household, because you actually came to cannabis, your parents apparently pretty rationally. We want to hear the dynamic.
Well, it was amazing what a difference it made. I mean, having a brother dying of cancer isn't that much fun, especially if they're on chemotherapy and they're lying in bed all the time. And then the cannabis really enabled my brother Danny to, when he wasn't using the cannabis, he'd be lying in his bed, or before they tried the cannabis, with a towel over his head and with a bucket by the bed and just throwing up for days after the chemotherapy. And then when he used the cannabis, he'd be able to he wouldn't feel great all the time. He wouldn't feel perfect, but he'd be able to eat and be able to hold down food and be able to maintain his weight. And he'd be downstairs strumming on his Fender Stratocaster, and he'd be playing with his little brothers. He was a really creative and engaged older brother. He'd always be inventing these homemade board games for us to play. And it just made such a difference to us to have our brother back. And, I sort of make the analogy, when my dad was undergoing end-of-life care, we used a lot of cannabinoids instead of opiates because he had, he had some pain, he had some cancers, and he had some pain. He was 92. He lived a very long life. And, I don't think there's anything sad about someone dying at age 92 after a long life if they're not suffering. I mean, that's just the life cycle. But I think in end-of-life care, they use so many opiates, and that the person's just so zonked out on these opiates. I mean, in addition, opiates make you itchy and constipated and really spaced out, and then make you fall. And my dad was so much more participatory and engaged in life for the last 6 to 8 months that we were using heavy duty cannabinoids. Of course, with my dad, as many of you know, you didn't have to like twist his arm to get him to use cannabinoids. He was very willing and able along those lines. But, you know, it was really amazing. You know, the night before he died, we had a birthday party, a Zoom for him, his 92nd birthday party with all of his kids and his grandkids. Of course, the night before he died, we didn't know that it was the night before he died, but he was participating and he even made a joke. And if you were on dose after dose after dose of morphine, he wouldn't have been engaged with us at all for like the last couple of weeks. I mean, I've seen this thousands of times over in end of life care just by being a doctor. And I would say the same is true with my brother, Danny. He had so much better a quality of life. And so many of the memories that I have are from the last 6 to 8 months because, you know, I was a little kid that I wouldn't have had if we didn't have cannabis. So I just think it's all about quality of life as opposed to quantity. And if you can improve someone's quality of life, that is a gift that is worth cherishing. And I think that's really the dynamic was relief and gratitude and sort of surprise, I think, on the part of my family because it had been so stigmatized against. And, you know, this was like in the early 1970s when like, you know, it was very polemicized. Just the use of cannabis was demonized. And so I think the surprise that like the whole edifice of like government nonsense about cannabis was completely not true, not like sort of partially not true, but like completely not true. So there were a lot of different dynamics, but I'm certainly happy that my brother was able to experience that relief and that I was able to witness it so that I'd have a slightly different perspective on this than like other doctors, and I'd be able to bring it into my medical practice. So I feel very grateful for all of that.
How did
If
she,
you would mind,
if you
how
could,
about your mother's role in this?
yes.
Just, I think that's where the heart of the question I meant to ask, intended to ask. Just, you know, we perceive her as being very brave, and that was courageous. So, you know, but also a little, you know, craziness given the times and everything. If you were able to describe any of that or share it.
My dad became like less rule abiding as he got older. But you know, he definitely was like a rule abiding psychiatrist when he was younger. And I just wonder if it was easier for my mom to like break that kind of taboo than it was for my dad, because it was, you know, my dad came from nothing. He was like dirt poor. He didn't even have a high school diploma. He never graduated from high school, and he made it through college on scholarship, and he made it through medical school on scholarship. I mean, he grew up dirt poor, and being a doctor really meant a lot to him because he was so self-made that I wonder if it was difficult for him to violate that taboo and break the law. Again, when later in life, he couldn't give a shit. Like he was waiting for the feds to come after him so that he could make a big case in the court of public opinion and just demolish them on cannabis later on. But like earlier, like in his 40s and 50s, when my brother Daniel was sick, probably in his 40s. And I think my mom was just sort of overwhelmed by sort of just the compassion as a mom and the grief at seeing your son suffering, that overrode any consideration. Am I breaking the law? Might I get in trouble? It wasn't even close. So I think it was like an easier decision for her. I'd have to ask her, but I think just because my dad, you know, had so much invested in being like the doctor and the member of the family who was educated and who got all those scholarships and is doing well for the family, I think it was easier for her to actually break the law and to procure the cannabis.
Thank you for that. I could feel the pain your brother's suffering the way we shared. Thank you so very, very much.
Absolutely.
Pleasure.
No, your mom was one of the original canna moms who took the risk, went and scored again in the darkest of the dark days to help your brother, which is humbling by all measures. And fortunately, your father was acceptance, because I've also heard of parents who their spouse does not agree with the methodology of and your brother was very fortunate to have two supportive parents as well as access to good cannabis. So I mean, it's a not necessarily a happy series of accidents, but how did she learn that? I mean, how did she go score that? I mean, how did she know to go score it? Was it, you know, did she have to go to an alley? Was it just from a friend? I mean, can you describe that for us, if you're aware of it?
I think she suspected that Danny and his friends had used it sort of recreationally. So I think she made an educated guess that if she asked his friend Mark, she would be able to score some. And when she did ask Mark, apparently she told me he looked like Like he was like gonna blow up. He was so stressed out. And he's like, I wouldn't know anything about that, Mrs. Grinspoon. And then Danny came home later that night and said, guess what, Mom? I have a pipe with some grass in it in my pocket. So Mark's understanding of how sick Danny was and love for Danny as a friend overrode any feeling that he would get in trouble or concern that he got in trouble. And of course, he must have known that my mom was pretty desperate to be snooping around the high school, playground asking for something which is obviously in any other circumstance would be pretty inappropriate. My mom's pretty mild mannered and rule abiding either. She's not like a biker chick. She's like pretty rule abiding at her 92 years of age. So I'm sure it was difficult for her and difficult for him, but it's a case study in people putting aside their discomfort for the greater good of someone that they love. And it is really a beautiful story in that sense.
Yeah, that's beyond humbling, and had to be some special, beautiful, yet tragic to watch all at the same time. So thank you for being raw and sharing with us, honestly during that. So Peter, you've treated patients and you've read a lot of research regarding the plant. Can you share the top 3 conditions that you believe cannabis has the most potential to treat? And I'm talking specifically within the veteran community. We're just going to be specific there. I know PTS crosses various other thresholds, but we're just going to, since we're veteran specific, we're just going to concentrate there and ask for your knowledge there. Could you share that with us?
Absolutely. Number one is chronic pain for veterans and for everybody else. Americans are getting older. They're getting portlier. Their knees, their hips, their backs are giving out. And as I mentioned earlier, the options for chronic pain are really unsatisfactory. The non-steroidals are very dangerous. Your ibuprofen, your Motrin, your Naprosyn, your Aleve, your diclofenac. They don't give you a heart attack. Like 10,000 people a year die from a heart attack from these medications. And they don't give you a bleeding ulcer. They slowly kill your kidneys. I see so many people with kidney damage in their 60s, 70s, 80s. And that's a really big deal if you start harming your kidneys. And then nobody wants to be on opiates, and Tylenol doesn't do anything. So cannabis is like the obvious treatment for like these millions of people in chronic pain. And I know veterans, I did a rotation at the Veterans Hospital in medical school, and I did a rotation for the Veterans Hospital in residency. And a close friend of mine is actually a neurologist at a Veterans Hospital. And I talk to him a lot. He's a memory specialist. And I know that chronic pain is just a huge issue in the veteran population. And they have these guidelines for using medical cannabis, and they're begrudgingly starting to put medical cannabis in them. And the American Medical Association still uses like these derogatory quotation marks around medical marijuana. Like it's not really a treatment. But in reality, if we used medical marijuana right after the Tylenol didn't work, before many of the non-steroidals, we protect millions of people's kidneys. And we're not talking about getting people like super high. We're talking about mostly CBD with a little bit of THC in it, much safer and less toxic. So I'm sort of an advocate of offering the patients that over like the daily ibuprofen that just kills your stomach and kills your kidneys. So I would say chronic pain is number one. I think a lot of veterans suffer from anxiety and stress and insomnia. Let's lump all those together. And what are the options for anxiety, stress, and insomnia? For insomnia, Ambien's a dangerous weapon. Trazodone can affect your heart and make you really groggy the next day. The benzodiazepines, the Valiums, the clonazepams, the lorazepams are very addictive, and they could affect your memory. There aren't great sleep medications. So again, it comes to like, is cannabis less toxic than whatever else you'd be using? For sleep, that's almost always the case. It's much more benign than many of these sleeping medications. Now, if it's anxiety, some people can get away with the SSRIs. The psychedelics are incredibly interesting in this regard too, but that's not really what we're talking about tonight. But I think there's going to be incredible potential for anxiety and depression, and I want to say the new, but really the old psychedelic treatments that are now being newly reaccepted. But I really think that, I have some vets on SSRIs, but I have another vet who, the third one is obviously PTSD. You can't really, PTSD is where there's the greatest chasm, the greatest gulf between the psychiatrists who think it makes everything worse, and the veterans who thinks it really helps them with their PTSD. And it's just astounding. This goes back to what I was talking about earlier. It sounds like two different plants grown on different planets under different suns. when you're talking about cannabis PTSD, when you're hearing a veteran talk, and when you're hearing, for example, an addiction psychiatrist talk. And the addiction psychiatrists don't treat people with PTSD with cannabis. So I don't know how they know whether it helps or hurts or works or doesn't work. And they tend to only read the negative literature, not the positive literature. So I don't think they're the most balanced people on this issue, which doesn't mean that it works, but it means that we need to at least listen. You know, my dad said, I believe it was in Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine. And Etienne, I think you were the Desert Storm veteran, right? In that story.
Yes, I am.
I have that right here. You can't see it because of my green screen. You know, my dad said in Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine, in the absence of like clear-cut data, because we don't have good data that anything works for PTSD, to be honest. Prazosin, what does that do? Nothing. We could help people with sleep with Ambien. We could help people with the anxiety with the benzodiazepines, but there's no good treatment for PTSD. And my dad said in the absence of really good data, we could do something very radical that doctors used to do a lot more often, which is listen to and trust our patients. So, you know, I sort of go back to that school with PTSD. If like one veteran says it's helping my PTSD, I think, oh, that's kind of curious. It's like hypothesis generating. But if 1 million people are saying the same thing, that's where there's smoke, there's usually fire. So I've had really good experience. I have one veteran, for example, in particular, that has done well. He was taking 6 shots of vodka twice a day just to calm his intrusive memories and nightmares. And he was like hiding out in his house. And now we have him on like a small puff or two twice a day from his vape pen. And he's not only is he not drinking and his liver tests have normalized, but he's also like going out to the vet center and going fishing with his buddies and hanging out and socializing. And he has a community again. And he's got his entire life back. And none of that would be possible if you were still like drowning his misery in vodka, as opposed to engaging and confronting his demons with the cannabis. And he's just doing so well. It's hard for me to imagine that they're so close-minded against it. So that was to make a short question long, but I would say the main ones are chronic pain, definitely insomnia and anxiety, and PTSD.
Thank you for that, as well as your explanation.
Oh, can I just add one more thing? Like as veterans get older, they get MS, they get Parkinson's, they get dementia-related behavior problems, they get Huntington. There are a million other diseases that, and fibromyalgia, and female vets get endometriosis and, you know, menopausal syndrome. So just the normal things that everybody gets, that you also get if you're a vet, cannabis is very helpful too as well. So it needs to be broadly available, not just tailored for a few of these indications, because we all get older and we all succumb to the same symptoms.
Amen. I'd say testify. But yes, you are correct. And yes, we are always getting older. With that, we're going to go to Council Member Michael Krawitz to go to our next question.
Thank you so much, Peter. Before I go to the next question, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your last answer. The work that we did in adding cannabis, adding post-traumatic stress as a qualifying condition to cannabis, I guess, raised the ire of the American Psychiatric Association. We didn't really face them when we were passing medical marijuana. I was a bit player, an activist working on Prop 215. I don't remember ever seeing them. But when we were working on adding post-traumatic stress as a qualifier, all of a sudden we were facing down the Psychiatric Association. And I found that to be the case, that they weren't really saying, hey, I've got a patient that had a problem, or that we were even seeing patients. It was always hypothetical based on, like you say, a critical reading of the most damning research, it seems like. So hearing you say it certainly confirms what I thought, but it means a whole lot more than me saying it, because I am, what am I, just a disgruntled vet trying to fight the entire American Psychiatric Association. So thank you for that. But the question is actually about the placebo effect. Before I say that, I thought it was fascinating in reading the literature, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember there being any placebo effect for nausea. So that having been said, the question is, we would like to know your thoughts on the placebo and nocebo effects, how they relate to cannabis and the endocannabinoid system, and how cannabinoids and opiates each have placebo and analgesic effects.
Well, let's tackle the nocebo first. The nocebo is when there's a negative effect that that has to do with people's expectations as opposed to the actual effect of the drug. And I actually am a little bit embarrassed to say that I was the victim of a nocebo effect. I was taking statin for my cholesterol, and I always thought the muscle aches were because of the statin that I was taking. I was convinced. I took the muscle statin and I would get muscle aches. And then I read a study where they did a placebo-controlled study, and like 80% of the time that people were getting muscle aches from statin, it was with the placebo, not even with the statin. Now that's the nocebo effect. That's a negative effect from a placebo. And then I said, holy shit, could this be me? And then I started taking my statin again, and I never got the muscle aches again. And it was all because they had put the idea that I was getting muscle aches in my mind. It was giving me a nocebo effect. So I actually think the nocebo effect is very real. And now I happily take a statin, not because I have super high cholesterol, because I like to eat whatever the fuck I want and not worry about it, which is just a very bad way that you do as a doctor. You just take pills to have your numbers look good. But the nocebo effect is definitely real, and it's really amazing. I'm not sure what it has to do with the endocannabinoid system, but the placebo effect is mediated by the endocannabinoid system. So is like runner's high. They used to think it was the opiates, but it's actually, if you jog 5 miles and you feel euphoric, that's your endocannabinoid system singing. It's not your opiates kicking in. And, you know, for every single pain medication, there's a placebo effect, which is really strong. I mean, the funny part is that the placebo effect is really strong and really effective. About 20, 30, 40 years ago, they decided that it was unethical for doctors to give patients a placebo because they thought it interfered with like informed decision-making, and it was against medical ethics. But I clearly remember the story my dad used to tell when he was on an airplane, and this woman was freaking out, like completely freaking out. And the passenger, the pilots were like, should we return the plane to Logan? Can we make it to San Francisco? Is there a doctor on the plane? So my dad, you know, had to stand up and say, I'm a doctor. And they're like, can you sit next to her and calm her down? So my dad sat next to her and gave her a pill and said in his most authoritative psychiatric voice, you know, this pill will make you feel calm and will fall asleep within 15 minutes. And he sat down next to her and gave her this pill, and she took the pill. And within 15 minutes, she was calm, she was asleep, she was snoozing away. They were allowed to land in San Francisco. There was no problem whatsoever. And what my dad had given her was a sugar pill. But it was a placebo effect that worked. So there is a huge placebo effect. And I have very mixed feelings about the fact that we're not allowed to do that, because I really feel like I could help people say, if I give you this for your pain, you're going to feel better. In fact, that's what we do when we give people Tylenol all the time. We hope that their pain gets better because Tylenol doesn't do anything. But the fact is, all the pain studies have big placebo effects. These anti-cannabis researchers did a recent study that they showed that there was a huge placebo effect for many of the studies that showed that cannabis had a positive effect in controlling pain. And they're like, aha, cannabis doesn't do anything. It's just the placebo effect. But then, you know, you look at the studies there's very little data that chronic opiates are effective for chronic pain. There's very little data that chronic non-steroidals, deadly as they are effective for chronic pain. And I think the placebo effect is a very common effect that medications have, and it makes it very, very difficult to find out what one drug is doing versus the placebo. Now, cannabis and particularly psychedelics are very hard to blind. It's very hard to factor out the placebo effect. You know, it's so funny, like they do these studies with psychedelics, and like 98% of patients guess that they've been given the placebo given the psychedelic as opposed to the placebo. Now, if I were given 125 micrograms of acid versus an inactive pill, I certainly would notice the difference. If like my face were melting off and the world were like breathing in and out, like obviously you're going to notice the difference if you're given a psychedelic or not. And I think that's also true for cannabis. Like most people can guess if there's a placebo or not. I mean, cannabis is psychoactive. Obviously, it gets people high for better or for worse. Many people enjoy it. Some people don't like it, but it has a big effect on you. So I think it's very difficult to factor out the placebo effect with studies of drugs that are psychoactive and have strong psychoactive effects. So I think it's going to be difficult to show definitively what's cannabis versus what's the placebo effect. But then again, cannabis does so many things at once. It helps numb the pain. It helps affect the part of your brain that says, this pain is bothering me. It helps the part of your brain that says the pain is a noxious sensation. So you're a fibromyalgia patient, you still feel your pain, or your sciatica, you still feel your pain, but you can still do other stuff because it's not bothering you as much. It helps you with your anticipatory pain, anticipatory anxiety, and with your insomnia and your quality of life. So, and it's also anti-inflammatory, and pain and inflammation are two sides of the same coin. So it just seems like it certainly does have a placebo effect, but it also has a very, very real effect. And I just don't think you do a service to anybody to try to write it off as a placebo effect. But it's a great question because it's very hard to study these things, because for better or for worse, the placebo effect pops up all the time and is very effective.
And that's why we asked. All right, next, let's see, will be Wade Laughter.
Well, I see that Michael Green just raised his hand.
Oh, I apologize. Did you have a follow-up, Michael?
I think so, unless I missed something. When you were talking about placebo in the book, it was so funny to read about how you try to do a blind study using cannabis and substituting placebo. If you could expound just a little bit on that, I think our audience would really, really enjoy that.
Well, they realized that most people notice a difference if they're giving cannabis versus nothing. So, and you know, in these studies, when they're always trying to find harms of cannabis, they tend to give very high doses of cannabis. You know, they never give someone 5 milligrams of a gummy and say, can you drive? They always give them like 300 milligrams and, you know, watch them weave down the street. So it's very obvious if you're given a placebo versus the cannabis, because it's a healthy, respectable dose of cannabis. And, you know, so then the researchers like, hey, I wonder if we can, you know, make the not so obvious when we're giving cannabis. So they started giving people other medications that they thought were psychoactive in the same way the cannabis was, showing how little they understand about cannabis, proving definitively that none of these researchers have ever tried cannabis ever, like even in a past life, because they would give people Benadryl. Now, the difference between Benadryl, which makes you sleepy and feel like you've been hit by a mental sledgehammer and groggy and sort of, and cannabis where you're awake and your sensations are electric and your thoughts are humming along at top speed. So that didn't work. So then they tried giving people lorazepam, which is Ativan, which is basically Valium. And then Valium, you feel a little happy, you feel relaxed, you feel sleepy, you basically feel drunk, which is like the opposite of what cannabis does. Like certainly it can make you feel a little bit relaxed and a little bit euphoric, but not in the same way that Valium would. Like no cannabis user like in human history has confused Valium with cannabis. They're like nothing alike. And I just thought it was really funny how they did those things. They were thinking, stone cold sober, not stone cold sober, were two ends on a continuum. Therefore, the Benadryl and the lorazepam and the Valium and the cannabis would all be the same thing, because they'd have you intoxicated like alcohol versus not intoxicated versus stoned, which is a very nuanced and complex mental and physical way of being. So I just thought it was really like preposterous. I tried not to make fun of them too much, but I don't think I succeeded along those lines.
All right, then we will continue on to Councilmember Wade Laughter.
Yes, this has been a great conversation, Peter. I really appreciate you taking all this time to hang out with us. One of the things, stigma associated with cannabis has kind of been an issue back when I was in the Navy. It got me in a lot of trouble. And it's to this day still an issue, certainly for those on active duty. And I know your father encountered a lot of this kind of negativity in the medical community in reaction to his coming out, if you will, about cannabis. Do you still see that going on in the medical community today, or is it just the young students, doctor students, and the few folks who have gotten far enough in their career not to care anymore that are really taking this point of view? What's your sense of that? Sorry for a confused question, but there you go.
No, it's improving. And I would say about now, something like 2/3 of doctors believe cannabis is a safe and effective medicine, not 100%. They're following the patients, but they're not as far along as the patients, but they're definitely a lot better than they used to be. Now, the stigma, again, it depends a little bit on the vantage point of the physician. Very little stigma among the oncologists. They just see it helping their patients. Oncologists are nice people. They don't want their patients to suffer. Very little stigma. And again, the psychiatrists tend to, and some of the pain doctors have sort of painted themselves into this intellectual corner where they feel like they have to still be against it until the end of time. So there's more stigma on their part. It's definitely not gone though. I mean, it's really interesting. I spoke to about 280 psychiatrists about 2 months ago in New Jersey. And they specifically asked me, can you talk about some of the positives as well as some of the harms? Because the last 3 lectures we've had have just been about cannabis use disorder and how bad it is. And our psychiatrists, especially our younger psychiatrists, are really interested in what you are helping people with. So I gave a very balanced presentation. I started out with the harms, and then I went into the benefits. And, you know, this is grand rounds. Medical grand rounds is like a solemn occasion. Like nobody interrupts anybody. I was speaking for an hour, and then there were 30 minutes of questions. And 10 minutes before I ended, this elderly psychiatrist literally interrupted me and started shouting me down and saying that every single thing I was saying was a lie and that none of it was true and that nobody should listen to me. And then the younger psychiatrist started defending me, and I got a lot of really nice emails and a lot of discussion on social media about how inappropriate that was. But I couldn't believe it. This guy could not control himself. So yeah, the stigma among certain old school, I have diagnosed it as OFS, which I call old fart syndrome. I think there's definitely a component of that. And they just are having trouble adopting to like the new world that we're living in. But I think it's sort of dying out because so many more doctors are seeing it helping their patients, or they're using it themselves and they're having benefit themselves, or they're seeing it help a family member, a brother, a parent, a kid. The use in the elderly is doubling every couple of years. I mean, that's the highest, the most rapidly growing demographic is use in the elderly, and people are really seeing benefits. So I think these sort of hardcore stigmatized, like anti-cannabis is the devil's lettuce, I think that's all going by the wayside. But, you know, these things die slowly. And unfortunately, some of the patients have internalized the stigma too, either by reflecting back what their doctors think or just from all the nonsense they've been exposed to. So like, you know, it's a very different conversation if you ask someone, have you ever used medical cannabis before? And they're like, well, I used it in college and I had a good time and I never had a bad reaction. That's a pretty easy person to get started on medical cannabis. If they're 85 years old and they say, I've never used it before, ever, that's a much longer conversation, and you have to overcome their feeling that it's somehow bad or dirty or wrong or not the right thing to do. And it's so unnecessary. It just makes people feel bad and makes them hesitant to use something which could quite possibly be a much safer and more appropriate medication for them. So we have a long way to go, but generally it's getting better. I see it getting better every year.
All right. Well, I cannot thank you enough. It has been, you know, we've gone almost an hour and a half. So I can't thank you enough for taking the time in that discussion, as well as, you know, you've answered all our questions. Michael Green, do you have another follow-up?
I do, thank you. Discussions going on in Washington right now about the debt ceiling. There's suggestions to budget cuts all over the place. One of the items they're talking about reducing funding for is the Mission Impact Act, which affects each and every veteran who looks for benefits in terms of medical care. I've just now on the brink of your chapter that talks about confusion in the cannabis, cost of cannabis. So I'm curious, I'm thinking there's been $1 trillion spent on the war on drugs since the 70s. How much of that might be to cannabis? And what would we save a year, if you have a number, if we just ended prohibition and we're not funding at least that portion of DEA's budget and other aspects, law enforcement, forget the social equity and everything else, just the fiscal cost?
Well, the costs are sort of so vast, they're hard to even calculate. Because first of all, there's the costs of not criminalizing people and traumatizing them with the social, with involvement in the criminal justice system and the trauma that they get. And, when someone gets arrested for cannabis, it affects their job prospects, their housing prospects, their student loans, their educational prospects, their right to vote. So it's infinite, the psychic and interpersonal poverty and damage that getting all these people needlessly involved with the criminal justice system costs. Number two, there's the cost of the criminal justice apparatus, which is so out of control. We have these, and the costs are not just financial, the cost to our communities of having these militarized drug units barging around is absolutely awful. It just unravels the whole fabric of our society. I mean, law enforcement are absolutely the wrong people to be involved in drugs, not just cannabis, any drugs. It should be doctors, nurses, social workers, lawyers, scientists, not law enforcement. If you get the justice system involved, everything gets worse. You still have whatever addiction or problem you've had, then you've got another problem, which your life is falling apart because of the criminal charges. So they're just like the wrong people to be involved in anyway. So we could save like hundreds of billions of dollars. Then there was a study then there was a study in 2016 from the Journal of Health Economics, where when they legalized cannabis recreationally in Colorado, the expenditure for Medicare D went down by about $200 million because people were using, even though it was just legalized recreationally, for whatever conditions that people could use cannabis for, they were using it. Chronic pain, insomnia, PTSD, multiple sclerosis. So the insurance companies are saving billions of dollars by the fact that people are substituting other more dangerous pharmaceuticals for cannabis. And they're saving money, first of all, because they don't have to pay for these overpriced pharmaceuticals like gabapentin or Lyrica, but also because people aren't destroying their kidneys by using all the non-steroidals or overdosing on opiates. So, I mean, there's so many different categories of saving that I think is pretty hard to calculate, but I'd say that the savings are just broad, they're vast, and they're not just financial, they're financial and in terms of interpersonal suffering. So, you know, if we could have ended the drug war before it started, that would have been better for our society.
Thank you so much.
Needless to say, Peter, is there anything that we've talked about or anything that you'd like to share with us before we let you go?
I really enjoy seeing a lot of friendly faces, and I thank you guys all for being such good friends to with my dad and my parents. And I'm glad you got to see my mom for a quick cameo visit. Next time we'll have her on. And, you know, we had a big book party for my book on April 20th. And she spoke in front of like 200 people, completely calm and poised. It was just really amazing. Yeah, no, just I think my book hopefully is going to help, you know, move the chains and get people educated. Hopefully it'll help get the doctors educated. And, you know, it's really aiming for the middle. I think a lot of people agree with a lot of stuff we said, but we've got to reach our neighbors and our friends and get them all on board. So I'm just hoping to make an impact and to stop this senseless war on cannabis users. I mean, every single society has used psychoactive drugs to change their consciousness. And it's just so hypocritical how our society picks which are the good drugs, you know, caffeine, alcohol, and tobacco, and which are the bad drugs like opiates and cannabis or cocaine. And they're just drugs. It's all about how we use them and if we use them responsibly. And again, law enforcement shouldn't be involved. And I'm just hoping to do my part in having us have more sensible and humane policies for people who use drugs, whether it be recreationally or medicinally. There's no reason for anybody to be stigmatized, criminalized, pathologized, or punished. So I just really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you guys tonight.
Well, it's been an honor for all of us. And we would like to, I'd like to thank all of our members tonight for joining us. Wade Laughter, Michael Green, George Armstrong, Nate Landau, Alex Popoff, Al Byrne, Michael Crowitz, Mary Lynn Mathry, and the Venerable Brian Buckley. I am Etienne Fontan, and thank you, Peter Grinspoon, for joining us, the Venerable Dr. Peter Grinspoon, to those who don't know him, but he let us call him Peter. So thanks, Peter. With that in mind, we'll wrap up from our V.A.C. Roundtable number 54. We were away the last couple of weeks because we were actually lobbying in Washington, D.C. So I want to thank Nate Landau, Michael Crowitz, Michael Green, Kendra Soul for going out to Washington, D.C. and making it happen. So we'll carry on. As we carry on, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with our next V.A.C. Roundtable number 55. So thank you again, everybody. You'll have a great rest of your Memorial Day weekend, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Hey, thanks, you guys. Bye-bye.